There is a strange mystery that almost nobody talks about, perhaps because nobody remembers when it happened. Somewhere in the distance between childhood and adulthood, something changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. There was no ceremony. No announcement. No day marked on a calendar. And yet almost everyone seems to share the same experience. Children begin life believing extraordinary things. They imagine impossible futures without embarrassment. They dream without apology. A child can stand in the middle of an ordinary room and see a castle. They can hold a stick and become an explorer. They can stare at the night sky and genuinely believe that one day they might walk among the stars. Nobody teaches them how to do this. They simply arrive that way. Yet as the years pass, something curious begins to happen. The same child who once believed anything was possible slowly begins asking different questions. Smaller questions. Safer questions. Questions designed not to discover life, but to avoid disappointment. And eventually, many people stop dreaming altogether. Not because they failed. Not because they lacked intelligence. Not because life was unfair. Something else happened. Something so ordinary that almost nobody notices it while it is taking place. A lesson repeated by loving parents, caring teachers, friends with good intentions, and entire societies trying their best to protect one another. A lesson disguised as wisdom. A lesson hidden inside phrases so common that they no longer sound dangerous. Be realistic. Play it safe. Don't get your hopes up. People like us don't do things like that. Nobody intends harm when they say these words. In fact, most people say them because they care. Fear rarely travels through hatred. More often, it travels through love. Generation after generation, people inherit invisible limitations from those who came before them, and because these limitations arrive wrapped in concern, they are rarely questioned. Eventually, many people become so accustomed to thinking small that they forget they ever thought differently. Yet every now and then, something unusual happens. A memory appears unexpectedly. An old dream returns without warning. A song, a photograph, or a random conversation suddenly reminds someone of the person they used to be. And for a brief moment, they experience something strange. Not sadness. Not regret. Recognition. A feeling difficult to explain. As though some forgotten part of themselves has quietly been waiting all these years to be remembered. Which raises a question that becomes more mysterious the longer you think about it. If nobody is born realistic, then where does realism come from? At what moment does wonder become caution? When did imagination become embarrassment? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all. If we learn to think small, is it possible that we can learn something else? Tonight, we explore the forgotten day many people unknowingly abandon wonder, and perhaps the mystery of how some people eventually find their way back. Chapter 1: Nobody is born realistic. Long before deadlines, responsibilities, bills, expectations, and survival became part of everyday life, human beings experience the world in a completely different way. Children live in a reality that adults often forget ever existed. To them, ordinary things are rarely ordinary. A blanket over two chairs becomes a fortress. A cardboard box becomes a spaceship. A puddle becomes an ocean waiting to be explored. They do not ask whether something is practical before imagining it. They do not measure dreams against statistics. They do not wonder whether they are qualified. They simply believe. Perhaps that is why childhood memories often feel almost mythical when adults look back on them. There was a time when entire afternoons felt endless. Summers seemed to last forever. Possibilities appeared everywhere. A child could stare out the window of a moving car and imagine entire worlds beyond the horizon. They could look at the moon and genuinely wonder if one day they might stand upon it. Nobody had yet informed them which dreams were acceptable and which dreams were foolish. Nobody had yet explained the invisible hierarchy of reality. Nobody had introduced embarrassment. In many ways, children possess a freedom that has nothing to do with money, status, or success. They possess permission. Permission to wonder. Permission to fail. Permission to imagine without needing proof. And perhaps that is why adults often smile with nostalgia when they watch children play. Somewhere deep inside themselves, they recognize something familiar. Something they once possessed. Yet there is another mystery hidden inside childhood. Children rarely think in terms of identity the way adults do. They do not spend every waking hour asking whether they are talented enough, attractive enough, intelligent enough, or successful enough. They simply move toward what fascinates them. Curiosity guides them more than fear. A child who falls while learning to ride a bicycle rarely concludes that bicycles are not meant for people like them. They simply get up and try again. Failure has not yet become personal. Disappointment has not yet become identity. Somewhere along the journey, adults inherit a different relationship with possibility. They begin measuring themselves, comparing themselves, protecting themselves. They slowly exchange curiosity for caution. Yet perhaps the strangest part of all is that nobody remembers the exact day this transformation occurred. People remember birthdays, graduations, weddings. They remember heartbreaks and funerals and first jobs. But almost nobody remembers the day they stopped believing impossible things might happen to them. Nobody remembers the day wonder quietly began surrendering to practicality, which makes the entire process feel even more mysterious. Because if the change was so gradual that nobody noticed it, perhaps it was never one moment at all. Perhaps it happened through thousands of tiny experiences accumulated over years. A disappointment here. An embarrassment there. A fear quietly inherited from someone else. Until eventually, the extraordinary became unrealistic and the unrealistic became impossible. Yet history continues revealing something fascinating. Every generation produces people who somehow protect that original sense of possibility. Scientists, artists, explorers, entrepreneurs, inventors, dreamers. Ordinary individuals who refuse to accept that reality is finished. Not because they are fearless. Not because they are special. But because something inside them remains connected to the person they once were. Perhaps that connection is the true mystery. Because maybe children are not unrealistic at all. Maybe they simply see possibilities adults have forgotten how to recognize. And perhaps the question was never why children dream so freely. Perhaps the real mystery is why so many adults stop. Chapter 2: The Invention of Invisible Ceilings. Perhaps the strangest part about invisible ceilings is that nobody builds them on purpose. There are no architects. No secret organizations. No grand conspiracies deciding how much a person is allowed to dream. Most invisible ceilings are built by ordinary people trying to protect one another from pain. A parent who struggled financially may encourage stability because they know what uncertainty feels like. A teacher who once abandoned their own ambitions may unknowingly pass that caution to their students. Friends who fear failure may discourage others from taking risks because seeing someone else attempt something extraordinary forces them to confront the dreams they themselves abandoned long ago. The remarkable thing is that these limitations rarely arrive as commands. They arrive as advice. Have a backup plan. Don't expect too much. Life doesn't work that way. Be practical. None of these phrases sound dangerous. In fact, many sound wise. Which is why they are rarely questioned. Yet something curious happens when people hear the same messages often enough. They stop distinguishing between possibility and probability. They stop asking what could happen and begin focusing exclusively on what usually happens. Little by little, invisible ceilings begin forming overhead. At first, they are so high that they seem harmless. A child still dreams. A teenager still hopes. A young adult still imagines different futures. But with each disappointment, embarrassment, rejection, and fear, the ceiling slowly lowers. And because the movement is gradual, almost nobody notices it. Years later, many people discover they are living inside boundaries they never consciously chose. Perhaps this is why so many adults experience a strange feeling when they meet someone pursuing an unusual path. Sometimes they admire them. Sometimes they envy them. Sometimes they criticize them. But deep down, many recognize something uncomfortable. They are witnessing someone living beyond a ceiling they themselves accepted years ago. The reaction is rarely about the other person. It is often about the forgotten parts of themselves. And perhaps that explains why extraordinary people have always made society uncomfortable. History is filled with individuals who ignored the limitations everyone else accepted as normal. Before achievements become obvious, they often appear foolish. Before breakthroughs become celebrated, they appear unrealistic. Before possibilities become history, they often appear impossible. Yet perhaps the most mysterious part of all is that invisible ceilings are inherited without anyone realizing it. Entire families inherit fears. Entire cultures inherit expectations. Entire generations inherit definitions of success they never personally chose. Some inherit the belief that security matters more than meaning. Others inherit the belief that dreams belong only to fortunate people. Some inherit the belief that happiness should always be postponed until responsibilities are complete. And because these ideas are passed from loving people to loving people, they often survive for generations without challenge. Nobody intends to imprison anyone. Everyone simply passes along what they believe kept them safe. Yet safety and fulfillment are not always the same thing. Somewhere along the way, many people quietly exchanged wonder for predictability without ever asking whether the trade was worth it. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Nobody remembers the exact day the ceiling appeared. Nobody remembers the first time they stopped believing certain futures belong to them. They simply wake up years later and discover they have been living inside a room much smaller than the one they once imagined. And perhaps the saddest part is that after enough time passes, people stop looking up altogether. Because you cannot miss the sky if you no longer remember it exists. Chapter 3, The Disease Called Be Realistic. Perhaps no phrase has quietly changed more lives than these two ordinary words. Be realistic. At first, they sound harmless. In fact, they often sound responsible. Loving even. Parents say them because they want their children to avoid pain. Friends say them because they fear disappointment. Teachers say them because they have witnessed failure. Entire societies repeat them because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Nobody wakes up intending to destroy dreams. Most people genuinely believe they are offering wisdom. And perhaps that is what makes the mystery so difficult to recognize. Fear rarely arrives wearing the face of fear. More often, it disguises itself as maturity. It disguises itself as practicality. It disguises itself as experience. Somewhere along the journey, many people begin believing that growing older means becoming smaller. They assume wisdom and imagination cannot coexist. They begin treating hope as naivety and possibility as danger. Yet history repeatedly reveals something strange. Nearly every breakthrough once appeared unrealistic. Every invention, every discovery, every movement that changed society first existed inside someone's imagination before it existed in reality. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If every extraordinary thing begins as an unrealistic idea, why are human beings so afraid of unrealistic ideas? Perhaps because disappointment hurts. Perhaps because people remember the dreams that failed more vividly than the dreams that succeeded. Or perhaps because watching someone pursue an extraordinary path forces others to confront something painful inside themselves. The dreams they abandoned. The risks they avoided. The person they once hoped to become. And so, without realizing it, many people slowly become guardians of limitations they never created. They inherit caution from previous generations and pass it forward believing they are protecting those they love. The cycle continues because nobody recognizes it as a cycle. Yet something even stranger eventually happens. After hearing "be realistic" enough times, people no longer need anyone else to say it. They begin saying it to themselves. They become their own critics. Their own doubters. Their own prison guards. A person who once imagined extraordinary possibilities eventually begins explaining why those possibilities no longer apply to them. I'm too old. It's too late. People like me don't do things like that. That ship has sailed. And after repeating these stories long enough, they begin sounding like facts. But perhaps they were never facts at all. Perhaps they were simply fears that had been repeated so many times they acquired the appearance of truth. And maybe the saddest part of all is that many people spend years believing they are seeing reality clearly when, in truth, they are only seeing the world through inherited limitations. Because realism itself is a curious thing. What one generation considers impossible, another generation eventually considers ordinary. Entire industries that once seemed ridiculous now shape modern life. Entire careers that never existed decades ago are now commonplace. Human history is filled with examples of yesterday's unrealistic dreams becoming tomorrow's accepted reality. Which means perhaps realism is not as permanent as people believe. Perhaps reality itself changes faster than fear can understand. And perhaps somewhere inside every adult who quietly says, "Be realistic," there still lives the child who once looked at the stars and believed impossible things could happen. Not because they were foolish. Not because they were naive. But because they had not yet learned to confuse uncertainty with impossibility. Chapter 4: The Graveyard of Abandoned Dreams. Perhaps the saddest cemetery in the world has no gates, no monuments, and no names carved into stone. It cannot be found on any map because it exists inside human beings. Hidden within that invisible graveyard are books never written, songs never composed, businesses never started, letters never sent, journeys never taken, and conversations that remained forever trapped inside silence. Most people assume regret comes from failure, but those who have lived long enough often reveal something completely different. Their greatest regrets rarely involve the things they attempted. Instead, they remember the things they almost did. The life they almost lived. The person they almost became. The opportunity they almost accepted. Because failure eventually becomes a story. Sometimes it even becomes a memory people laugh about years later. But unanswered questions have a strange way of surviving. They remain unfinished. They return unexpectedly during quiet moments. They appear while looking through old photographs. They appear during long drives. They appear when hearing songs from another chapter of life. And sometimes they appear in the middle of ordinary days when a person suddenly wonders, what would have happened if I had said yes? Perhaps that is why certain memories feel heavier than others. Not because they are painful, but because they still contain possibility. Somewhere in every life there are abandoned roads. The instrument that stopped being played. The language that was never learned. The business idea written on a piece of paper and forgotten inside a drawer. The country that was always going to be visited someday. The dream that was postponed because life became busy. Yet dreams rarely disappear dramatically. That is part of the mystery. They do not explode. They do not announce their departure. They simply become quieter. A person postpones something for a year. Then another year. Responsibilities increase. Survival becomes the priority. Families must be supported. Bills must be paid. Time moves forward. And little by little, dreams begin adapting to smaller spaces until eventually people stop mentioning them altogether. Not because they no longer care, but because talking about them begins to hurt. And perhaps this explains something many people feel but struggle to describe. Why certain movies make them emotional. Why stories about second chances affect them so deeply. Why they become unexpectedly quiet when they see someone pursuing a dream they once carried themselves. It is not jealousy. It is recognition. Somewhere deep inside, forgotten parts of themselves are being reminded that they once existed. And perhaps this is why older people often speak differently about time. When people are young, they fear failure. But as years pass, many begin fearing something else entirely. Not trying. Because failure closes a door. But never trying leaves the door permanently open. And open doors can haunt people for decades. Yet perhaps even this invisible graveyard contains a mystery few people understand. Because not every abandoned dream is truly dead. Some are only sleeping. Some have simply been buried beneath responsibilities and survival. Some are patiently waiting for a season when they can breathe again. And perhaps that is why certain dreams return after decades of silence. A retired teacher begins painting. A grandfather finally learns the piano. A woman in her 60s starts traveling the world. A man who spent his entire life supporting others suddenly begins writing the stories he carried inside himself for 40 years. Which raises a beautiful possibility. Perhaps dreams are more patient than people realize. Perhaps they understand seasons better than we do. And perhaps some of the things we believed we lost were never truly gone. They were simply waiting for us to remember them. Chapter 5: Why Some People Wake Up Again. One of the great mysteries of adulthood is that some dreams seem to vanish forever, while others quietly survive beneath the surface for decades. Nobody talks about this because it doesn't fit neatly into explanations. Yet history is filled with strange stories of people who rediscovered themselves long after they believed that chapter had ended. A retired accountant begins painting for the first time in 50 years. A grandmother learns a new language and travels to places she once only saw in magazines. A man who spent his life providing for everyone around him finally begins writing the stories he carried inside himself since childhood. A woman who buried her creativity beneath responsibilities suddenly finds herself buying a piano at the age of 63. From the outside, these moments often appear random. Friends describe them as midlife crises. Families sometimes dismiss them as strange phases. But perhaps something deeper is happening. Perhaps certain dreams never disappear completely. Perhaps they simply wait. Human beings are remarkable creatures. They can survive difficult chapters. They can adapt. They can endure responsibilities, heartbreak, disappointments, and years of routine. But somewhere beneath survival, parts of themselves remain preserved. Like seeds waiting beneath winter soil, certain desires seem capable of surviving astonishing amounts of time. Which raises an interesting question. Why do forgotten dreams return when they do? Why does a song suddenly awaken memories from 30 years earlier? Why does seeing someone else's journey unexpectedly move us? Why do certain books, movies, or conversations affect people so deeply at different stages of life? Perhaps because human beings do not experience life in straight lines. Perhaps there are seasons for survival and seasons for rediscovery. Seasons for sacrifice and seasons for renewal. And maybe many people mistakenly assume that one difficult chapter represents the entire story. Yet life repeatedly reveals something curious. The chapters people believe are endings often become transitions instead. Many individuals spend years believing they missed their opportunity, only to discover that opportunity itself had changed form. The dream no longer looks exactly the same, but the essence remains. The child who once dreamed of becoming a musician may never perform in concert halls, yet music still returns to their life. The traveler who postponed adventures while raising a family may finally see the world decades later. The writer who abandoned novels to build a career may eventually find themselves returning to the stories they never forgot. And perhaps this is why stories about second chances resonate so deeply with human beings. They remind us of something we secretly hope is true. That life is not always finished when we think it is. That meaning can return. That wonder can return. That purpose can return. Perhaps this explains why some people seem to come alive again later in life. They laugh differently. They speak differently. They become curious again. Friends often describe these transformations by saying, they seem like themselves again. Which is a fascinating phrase when you think about it. Because perhaps they are not becoming someone new at all. Perhaps they are returning to someone old. Returning to parts of themselves that patiently survived beneath years of responsibilities and expectations. And maybe that is one of the most beautiful mysteries in human existence. Not that people change. But that certain parts of who we truly are seem unwilling to disappear completely. They wait. Quietly. Patiently. Through disappointments, through obligations, through seasons of survival. Waiting for the moment when life finally creates enough space for them to breathe again. And perhaps that is why hope itself remains so difficult to destroy. Because somewhere deep inside many people lives the strange suspicion that their story may not be over yet. And perhaps they are right. Chapter 6: The Return of Wonder. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about adulthood is the belief that growing older and growing smaller are the same thing. Somewhere along the journey, many people begin assuming that maturity requires abandoning wonder. They learn to admire certainty and distrust curiosity. They become efficient, responsible, dependable, and practical. None of these things are wrong. In fact, they are necessary. Families must be supported. Responsibilities must be honored. Life demands seriousness at times. Yet perhaps something unfortunate happened when society convinced people that wonder itself belonged only to children. Because wonder was never childish. Wonder is what allows human beings to remain open to mystery. It is what causes people to look at the ocean and still feel something they cannot explain. It is what causes someone to stand beneath the night sky and suddenly remember how small and extraordinary life truly is. It is what makes music move us, stories affect us, and certain memories remain sacred long after the moments themselves have passed. Wonder reminds people that existence itself is strange and beautiful. Yet many adults slowly replace wonder with certainty because certainty feels safer. Mystery requires humility. Wonder requires vulnerability. To remain curious in a world that constantly demands answers is its own form of courage. And perhaps that is why some people never completely lose it. They continue asking questions. They continue discovering new interests. They continue reading, traveling, learning, exploring, and allowing life to surprise them. They do not possess fewer problems than everyone else. They simply refuse to believe that reality has revealed everything it has to offer. Perhaps this explains why some elderly people possess a youthful spirit that others cannot explain. They laugh easily. They remain fascinated by ordinary things. They still speak about future plans. They still become excited by possibilities. Their bodies may have aged, but something inside them remains beautifully unfinished. And perhaps that unfinished quality is not a flaw. Perhaps it is evidence that human beings were never meant to arrive completely. Maybe life was never designed to become predictable. Maybe mystery itself is part of the gift. Because some of the most meaningful experiences people ever have arrive unexpectedly. Friendships they never anticipated. Places they never planned to visit. Conversations they never expected to remember. Entire chapters they could not have imagined years earlier. Looking back, many people eventually discover that the moments which changed them most were rarely the moments they controlled. They were the moments they encountered. Which raises a beautiful possibility. Perhaps life is not asking us to recover childhood. Perhaps life is inviting us to carry wonder into adulthood. To become responsible without becoming cynical. To become wise without becoming closed. To become experienced without becoming hopeless. Because experience should expand people, not shrink them. And maybe the return of wonder does not happen all at once. Maybe it begins quietly. A forgotten dream. A new interest. A conversation. A book. A song. A journey. A sunset that suddenly feels different than all the sunsets before it. Small moments that remind people something inside them is still alive. Perhaps this is why certain stories affect us so deeply. Not because they give answers, but because they awaken memories. They remind us that we once viewed the world differently. And perhaps the most extraordinary discovery is that wonder itself was never lost. It was simply buried beneath fear, responsibilities, disappointments, and years of believing that practicality and possibility could not exist together. But perhaps they can. Perhaps the stars that fascinated us as children are still above us now. Perhaps the dreams changed shape but never disappeared. Perhaps curiosity survived. Perhaps hope survived. And perhaps the story we thought had ended years ago is still being written. Because maybe life is stranger, larger, and more beautiful than we allow ourselves to believe. And maybe the greatest mystery is not why children possess wonder. Maybe the mystery is why adults are so surprised when they discover it never truly left.
Maybe nobody can return to childhood. And perhaps that was never the purpose. Maybe the purpose was always to carry something from childhood into the rest of our lives. Not innocence, because life teaches difficult lessons. Not certainty, because certainty was always an illusion. But wonder. The ability to remain curious. The ability to remain open. The ability to believe that life may still contain chapters we cannot yet see. Because the world already contains enough cynicism, enough people convinced they have seen everything, enough individuals who quietly believe their most meaningful days belong to the past. Yet history tells a different story. Human beings continue surprising themselves. New dreams appear, forgotten passions return, unexpected friendships are formed. Entire lives change in ways nobody could have predicted. Perhaps that is why hope has always survived every generation. Not because life is easy, but because mystery remains. And perhaps that mystery is one of the greatest gifts we possess. So, if somewhere during this journey you remembered a dream, a memory, or a forgotten part of yourself, perhaps that feeling was not an accident. Perhaps some things are never truly lost. Perhaps they simply wait to be remembered. This is Unchartered Decision. If these stories help you see modern life with a little more wonder, consider joining us for future journeys into the mysteries hidden inside being human. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries are not found somewhere far away. Sometimes they have been quietly waiting inside us all along.